Service teardown. HP ProDesk 480 G5MT. How to replace the access panel. Before you begin, remember to detach all cables that connect to the PC. Whenever working on internal components, use an anti-static mat. Wear an ESD wrist strap attached to the PC when working with sensitive components that are inside the PC to avoid damaging them. Make sure to ground the chassis to the mat. Removal. Loosen the thumb screw at the rear of the access panel. Grab the handle on the rear of the access panel and pull slightly to the rear before pulling up on the back of the access panel. Remove the access panel from the unit. Replacement. The access panel has several tabs on its side and leading edges. Which fit into slots and under the front lip of the PC. There are also two tabs on the rear inside edge that slide into slots on the rear of the chassis. Note that the rear tabs can get bent easily and make it difficult to replace the panel. Before replacement, make sure the rear tabs are unbent and in a parallel position to the surface of the panel. There is also a small slot on the rear of the access panel that a lock slot on the PC slides into. To reattach the access panel, align the tabs on the access panel over the corresponding slots on the PC. Slide the access panel forward until the lock slot at the rear of the PC is fully through the small slot on the rear of the access panel. Tighten the thumb screw to secure the access panel to the unit. How to replace the optical drive. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Detach the power and data cables from the rear of the optical drive. Press on the green drive release latch at the rear of the drive and slide the drive out the front of the unit. If you are replacing the optical drive with a new optical drive, pull the green drive release latch off of the optical drive. Insert a straightened paper clip or other similar tool into the force eject hole on the optical drive to eject the drive tray. Pry and push out the tabs securing the bezel to the optical drive, and remove the bezel from the drive. Replacement. The optical drive bezel has several tabs that fit into slots on the front of the optical drive. To install a new optical drive, press the old optical drive bezel onto the optical drive until the tabs are secured. There are two small pins on the green drive release latch that fit into two small holes on the side of the optical drive. Press the drive pins into their holes to secure the latch to the new optical drive. Slide the drive into its drive bay through the front of the PC until the green release latch snaps into place. Replace the power and data cables to the rear of the optical drive. How to replace the drives cage. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Disconnect the power and data connectors from the hard drive or drives in the cage. Push the hard drive cables down completely toward the motherboard area. Disconnect the power and data connectors from the optical drive. Lift the inside edge of the cage slightly. Slide the cage toward the center of the unit and lift it out of the PC. Replacement. There are 2 pegs on each side of the drive's cage that slide into slots on the frame of the PC. To replace the drive's cage, insert the 2 front side pegs of the cage into their slots. Slide the cage forward while swinging down the inside edge of the cage. Reconnect the power and data cables to the optical drive. Pull the hard drive cables back up from the motherboard area to the cage. Reconnect the power and data cables to the hard drive or drives installed in the cage. How to replace the hard disk drive. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drive's cage. Removal. Detach the 2 Torx T15 screws, one on each side, that secure the hard drive to the drive's cage. Slide the drive toward the center of the cage and pull it out of the cage. If replacing the hard drive, detach the 2 remaining Torx T15 guide screws on the sides of the hard drive and reserve them for later use. Replacement. To install a new hard drive, attach the 2 reserved Torx T15 guide screws to the sides of the new hard drive. Note: leave the holes nearest to the connector edge of the drive empty. The 2 guide screws on the hard drive align with slots on the drive's cage. When replacing the hard drive, align the side screws of the drive into their slots, with the hard drive spindle side down. Then tip the hard drive down into place. Secure the hard drive to the cage with the 2 Torx T15 screws toward the center of the cage. How to replace the system memory. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drive's cage. Removal. Simultaneously push down on the clips on either side of the DDR4 DIMM socket to release the memory module. Carefully pull the memory module out of the unit. Replacement. There is 1 notch on the bottom of every DDR4 DIMM module, offset from the center, that fits over a tab in the DDR4 DIMM memory socket. When installing DDR4 DIMMs, align the notch on the module with the tab in the socket. Press the module into the socket until the clips on both sides of the socket lock into place. How to replace the wireless LAN board. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drive's cage. Removal. Carefully snap off the antenna connectors from the wireless LAN board. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw, securing the wireless LAN board in place. The board will pop up. Remove the board from its motherboard socket. Replacement. The wireless LAN board has a notch, offset from the center, which aligns over a key in its motherboard slot. To replace the wireless LAN board, angle the board into its motherboard socket at a 30-degree angle and press down. Hold it down while replacing the Phillips No. 1 screw to secure it to the motherboard. Replace the antenna connectors to the board. The antenna connectors are labeled 1 and 2 and should be connected to the corresponding 1 and 2 labeled ports on the wireless LAN board. Note: the front antenna is antenna 2 and the rear antenna is antenna 1.
How to replace the expansion cards.
Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drives cage. Removal. Detach any internal connectors from other system components. Lift the latch for the expansion card's retaining bracket and swing the bracket out. Press on the latch for the PCI by 16 slot on the motherboard if removing a card from the PCI by 16 slot. Carefully pull out the expansion card. Replacement. To replace an expansion card, carefully align and push the card into its slot on the motherboard until it is fully seated. If installing a graphics card and a serial PS2 module is installed, be careful not to trap the serial PS2 module connector under the card. Rotate the expansion card's retaining bracket back into place to secure the card. Attach any internal connectors necessary to other system components.
How to replace the system fan.
Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Detach the fan connector from the motherboard. Remove the 3 Phillips No. 2 screws that secure the fan to the rear of the PC. Keep your hand on the fan as you remove the last screw to keep it from falling. Then pull the fan out of the PC. Replacement. There is a hole on the bottom inside corner of the system fan that aligns over a small post on the rear of the PC. To replace the system fan, align the fan so it is blowing outward. The label on the fan should be facing out of the system. The connector should be aligned toward the bottom of the unit. Align the hole of the fan over its post and align the screw holes of the fan with the screw holes at the rear of the PC. Secure the fan to the rear of the PC with its 3 Phillips No. 2 screws. Reattach the fan connector to the motherboard.
How to replace the solid-state drive.
Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drives cage. Removal. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw, securing the solid-state drive in place. A drive will pop up. Carefully pull out the solid-state drive out of the system board socket. Replacement. The solid-state drive has a notch on its edge that aligns over a key in its system board socket. To replace the solid-state drive, angle the drive into its system board socket at a 30-degree angle, engaging the notch over its socket key, and press the drive down. Hold it down while replacing the Phillips No. 1 screw to secure the drive in the unit.
How to replace the main bezel, dust filter bezel.
Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Unlatch the 3 side tabs of the main bezel and rotate the bezel away from the PC. Some units will have a dust filter bezel attached to the main bezel. To replace the main bezel or the dust filter bezel in these units, pry the 2 bezels apart until they separate. Replacement. If installing a new dust filter bezel, press and snap the dust filter bezel onto the main bezel until all edges on the bezels are flush. The main bezel has 3 hooked tabs on the right side and 3 tabs with cutouts on the left side, which fit over tabs and over alignment posts on the chassis. To replace the main bezel, align the hooked tabs on the right side of the bezel over their tabs. Then rotate and press the left side of the bezel until the cutout tabs snap over their posts.
How to replace the heatsink.
Before you begin, remove the access panel and the drives cage. Removal. Detach the heatsink connector from the motherboard. Loosen the 4 captured Torx T15 screws for the heatsink. Gently pull the heatsink out of the PC. Replacement. Before replacing the heatsink into the system, first clean off the old thermal grease from the microprocessor. Clean the grease from the heatsink if you are replacing the same heatsink into the system. Apply new thermal grease or pad to the microprocessor. Align the 4 screws of the heatsink over the 4 screw holes on the motherboard, with the connector aligned toward the top of the unit. Tighten the 4 Torx T15 heatsink screws. Reattach the heatsink connector to the motherboard.
How to replace the CPU.
Before you begin, remove the access panel, the drives cage, and the heatsink. Removal. Press down to release the CPU load lever from its retention tab and pull it back. Lift the load plate off the socket. Identify pin 1 on the socket by the mark on the corner of the socket stencil.
Carefully remove the CPU from the socket. Place the CPU in an anti-static bag.
Note: use of an Intel CPU removal replacement tool is recommended for all regions and required in some regions. Replacement. To replace the CPU, first identify the pin 1 position on the microprocessor by noting the yellow mark on the corner of the chip assembly.
Identify pin 1 on the socket on the motherboard by the mark on the corner of the socket stencil. Align the yellow mark on the corner of the CPU chip assembly with the mark on the corner of the socket stencil on the motherboard. Carefully place the CPU into the socket on the motherboard.
Swing the load plate down. Lock the load lever under its retaining tab to secure the microprocessor in place.
How to replace the power supply.
Before you begin, remove the access panel, the main bezel, and the drives cage. Removal. Detach all power supply connectors from the motherboard. Note: the motherboard connectors have a latch that must be pressed to release the connectors. Snip the 2 plastic cable ties that secure the power supply connectors to the front metal of the chassis. Detach the 3 Torx T15 screws that connect the power supply to the PC. Press the latch at the inside edge of the power supply in the unit and slide the power supply into the PC before fully removing it from the unit. Replacement. There is a slot on the side of the power supply that slides over a large tab on the side wall of the chassis. To replace the power supply, align the power supply slot slightly behind the chassis tab. Then slide the power supply back until it locks into place next to the latch. Reattach the 3 Torx T15 screws at the rear of the chassis. Secure the power connectors to the front of the chassis with 2 plastic cable ties. Note: the bottom cable tie should be the only cable tie to secure both sets of cables. Reconnect all power connectors to the motherboard.
How to replace the speakers.
Before you begin, remove the access panel, the main bezel, and the drives cage. Removal. Detach the speaker connector from the motherboard. Remove the two Torx T15 screws at the front of the PC that secure the speaker to the front of the PC. Keep your hand on the speaker as you detach the second screw and pull the speaker out of the unit. Replacement. There are two small holes on the speaker that fit over small alignment pegs on the front, inside of the PC. To replace the speaker, press the speaker holes over their alignment pegs with the connector aligned toward the motherboard. Replace the two Torx T15 screws at the front of the unit to secure the speaker to the unit. Reattach the speaker connector to the motherboard.
How to replace the wireless LAN antennas.
Before you begin, remove the access panel, the main bezel, and the drives cage. Removal. Carefully snap off the antennas from the wireless LAN board. Pull the rear antenna cable from the small cable tunnel at the top of the chassis. There is a hooked tab securing the rear antenna cover into place. Squeeze the tab to release the hooked side of the cover and pull the rear antenna cover off of the unit. Detach the Torx T15 screw for the rear antenna. Pull the rear antenna out of the rear of the unit. Pull the front antenna cable out to the front of the unit through the front unit grill. Free the front antenna from the cable guides at the front of the unit. Detach the Torx T15 screw for the front antenna. Remove the front antenna from the unit. Replacement. Each antenna has a small hole that fits over a small locator peg on the front or rear of the PC. To replace the front antenna, align the hole on the antenna over its alignment peg. Secure the front antenna with its Torx T15 screw. Place the front antenna cable into the cable guides at the front of the unit. Feed the front antenna cable back into the inside of the unit through the small hole marked ANT. Feed the rear antenna in through its access hole at the rear of the unit. Align the rear hole over its peg and secure the rear antenna with its Torx T15 screw. The rear antenna cover has two small tabs on one side and a hook tab on the other that fit into slots on the rear of the unit. To replace the rear antenna cover, insert the two tabs into their slots. Then press the hook tab into its slot until the cover is securely in place. Place the rear antenna cable into the small cable tunnel on the top inside of the chassis. Replace the antennas to the wireless LAN board. The antenna connectors are labeled 1 and 2 and should be connected to the corresponding 1 and 2 labeled ports on the wireless LAN board. Note, the front antenna is antenna 2 and the rear antenna is antenna 1.
How to restore CMOS to factory settings.
Before you begin, restore the CMOS factory settings first, before replacing the system motherboard. To do so, first remove the access panel. Procedure: remove the battery from the motherboard. Wait 30 seconds. Replace the battery to the motherboard. CMOS factory settings are now reset. Note, You will now need to enter the system BIOS and reset the clock in BIOS after this procedure.
How to replace the motherboard.
Before you begin, remove the access panel, the main bezel, and the drives cage. Remove any expansion cards or the PS2 and serial port module if installed in the unit. Remove system memory, the wireless LAN board, the solid-state drive, the SD card reader if installed in the unit, the heatsink, and the CPU. Removal. Detach all remaining system connectors from the motherboard. Remove the 7 Torx T15 screws that attach the motherboard to the PC. Slide the motherboard toward the front of the unit. Tip the rear of the motherboard up and remove it carefully from the unit. Place the motherboard in an anti-static bag. Replacement. To replace the motherboard, carefully tip the front edge of the motherboard into the unit. Clear connectors away from under the motherboard and place the motherboard entirely down, sliding the rear connector ports into their cutouts on the rear of the chassis. Replace the 7 Torx T15 screws to secure the motherboard to the unit. Replace all connectors to the motherboard.